On November 16, 1951, Captain Dennis Cambell walked up the gangway to the HMS Illustrious in Portsmouth Harbor. In his briefcase was a single piece of paper with a basic sketch, a flight deck angled 10 degrees to the left. It looked simple, almost too simple to matter. But within a year and a half, that drawing would go on to save more pilots' lives than any weapon ever made. At that time, Captain Cambell was already deeply worried. Over the past year, the Royal Navy had lost 43 planes in landing accidents. 17 pilots had died. Many others were seriously hurt. And all those crashes happened in the last 30 seconds of flight, when a jet moving 140 miles per hour tried to land on a swaying deck, hoping to catch an arresting wire, with a steel safety barrier just 60 feet ahead. If the plane missed a wire, the barrier would tear it apart. The situation was even worse for the U.S. Navy. In 1951, they recorded 776 major carrier accidents, meaning deaths or complete aircraft loss, that averaged out to more than 2 every single day, even though the country wasn't in a full-scale war. The Korean conflict only made things worse. The USS Boxer had 7 barrier crashes on one deployment. The Princeton lost 9 planes in just 4 weeks. On carriers with straight decks, if a jet missed the wires, it had 2 outcomes: either slam into barrier at full speed or crash into the parked aircraft at the front of the deck, sometimes triggering explosions that could kill many crew members instantly. Jet planes had changed everything. Older planes like the Hellcat could land at slower speeds and respond quickly to throttle changes. Newer jets like the F-9F Panther landed faster, about 40 knots faster, and their engines were slow to react. If a pilot needed more power during landing, the engine took around 7 seconds to respond. That was far too long when the plane was dropping toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers would wave paddles from the side of the ship, trying to guide pilots in. But by the time a pilot realized something was off, too fast, too low, too high, it was often already too late. Everyone involved, admirals, engineers, test pilots, understood the hard truth. Carrier operations were no longer safe. Jet aircraft were clearly the future, but the present was killing too many people. What Captain Cambell didn't know that day, and what no one in that Portsmouth meeting room knew, was that his angled deck idea would be laughed at, dismissed, and considered impossible by the very experts who were supposed to solve these problems. The real solution wouldn't come from labs or long meetings. It would come from one person who refused to accept that pilots should die because of design flaw. This whole problem started back in 1945 when Lieutenant Commander William P. Bill Ron made the first jet landing on the USS Wake Island. His FR, one Fireball landed at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than older piston planes. The arresting cable screeched under force. The landing worked, but the warning signs were ignored. By 1950, every major navy faced the same issue. Jet engines made planes faster and could fly higher, but they had a big downside: slow throttle response. On propeller planes, pilots could cut the engine quickly and drop onto the deck. Jets couldn't do that. They had to stay powered up during landing in case they needed to abort, but their engines couldn't give quick power when it was needed most. This led to a dangerous situation. Pilots approached the carrier with their engines already running high, committed to landing. If they missed the wires, they couldn't just pull up and try again. They didn't have the speed or the time. On a straight-deck carrier, 4 arresting wires stretched across a 60-foot area. Behind those was the crash barrier, a web of steel cables designed to stop jets that missed the wires. Behind that were parked planes, fuel trucks, and all the gear needed to keep the flight deck running in combat. The numbers were brutal. A Panther landing at 125 knots covered about 211 feet per second. If a pilot missed all 4 wires, they had just over 2 seconds before hitting the barrier. Sometimes the barrier worked. When it didn't, the result was catastrophic. 30 tons of fuel and explosives crashing forward at 100 miles per hour. Captain Bruce Williams, the air operations officer on the USS Kearsarge, witnessed the worst in March 1951. A barrier failed. The plane hit at full power, ripped through the barrier, and crashed into 6 parked Corsairs. A fire broke out and reached the aviation fuel stores. The damage, 14 aircraft destroyed, 11 lives lost, 23 people injured. The ship had to stop flight operations for 2 days. At the time, the only real solution anyone had was to try building better barriers. The British even tested something called the flex deck, a rubber surface meant to catch jets that landed without using their landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown made 40 landings on it at Farnborough and wrote in his reports that the idea basically worked. To his friends, Eric Brown described the flex deck as absolutely terrifying. Meanwhile, in the U.S., officials focus on stronger safety systems. The Bureau of Aeronautics spent $3.2 million creating the Davis Barrier, a high-tech net designed to stop a 25,000-pound jet even at full throttle. When it worked, it was impressive. When it didn't, the results were disastrous. But even the strongest barriers didn't stop the crashes. They just kept the wrecks from getting worse. Experienced pilots and commanders understood the real issue, the layout of the flight deck itself. Back in June 1945, Captain William T. Razier, who led aircraft design requirements for the Navy, put it plainly, the current setup forced every landing into a tiny 60-foot zone, with zero room for mistakes. That was fine for older planes, but not for jets. His message, our ships were made for 1940s propeller planes. We're trying to land 1950s jets on them. Until we fix this, people keep dying. Everyone knew it. Everyone saw the problem. But no one had a fix. The British tried flexible landing decks. The Americans built tougher and more advanced barriers. The French tried making aircraft lighter. Nothing made a real difference. The number of accidents kept rising. What they needed was someone bold enough to question the one thing nobody ever challenged. Why did the landing area have to run straight down the center of the ship? That person was Dennis Cambell. Captain Dennis Royal Farson, Cambell wasn't picked to solve big design problems. He worked in an office. Born on November 13, 1907, in Southsea, England, Cambell joined the Royal Navy in 1925. He became a pilot in 1931, flying the old fabric biplanes of the early days. But he understood early that naval aviation wasn't a hobby. It was a serious, technical profession. During World War II, he flew slow, outdated swordfish torpedo bombers, but they still managed to cripple the German battleship Bismarck. For that, he earned the Distinguished Service Cross. People respected him, but nobody called him a genius or visionary. After the war, he was given a desk job at the Ministry of Supply as the Royal Navy's deputy representative. He handled paperwork, kept track of schedules, sat in coordination meetings, and signed forms. He had no engineering degrees and no technical training. But he had one thing that degrees don't teach. He couldn't look the other way when pilots were dying. In 1951, Cambell went to funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a young test pilot who crashed into the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had once been a student. He was just 23 years old. His approach and speed were textbook perfect, but he missed the wires by 6 feet. The barrier failed. The jet was torn apart. His wife was 5 months pregnant. Cambell stood at the graveside, shaken. Later, he told his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is madness. We're killing them with our own gear. The pilots are doing everything right, and they're still dying. 60 feet just isn't enough. There has to be a better way." Goodhart figured Cambell was just venting. People often say things like that at funerals. But this time was different. Cambell couldn't let it go. He dug through accident reports. He interviewed landing signal officers. He studied how jets came in for landing. He was an engineer, so he started drawing. Diagrams, sketches, anything to help him think through the problem. The breakthrough came during a train ride from Portsmouth to London. He was sketching flight decks, thinking about how to give pilots more room. If he couldn't make the deck longer or wider, what else could he do? Then it hit him. What if the deck wasn't straight? He drew a new shape. The landing area angled 10 degrees to the left. Instead of ending at a barricade, the new path ended over the sea. Now, if a pilot missed the wires, they wouldn't crash into anything. They could push the throttle, pull up, and try again. No barrier, no fireball, no disaster. Just a second chance. The idea felt too simple. He wasn't sure if he'd stumbled onto something big or missed some obvious reason why it wouldn't work. So he brought it to the experts. On August 7th, 1951, Cambell held a meeting at the Ministry of Supply. Around the table were top names: Louis Boddington from the Naval Air Department, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, and 6 experienced aviation engineers. Cambell opened his briefcase and showed them his sketch. The reaction was instant. "That's completely illegal," one senior officer said. Commander James, a top expert in flight operations, didn't even raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words carried the finality of physical law. One of the engineers pushed back hard. "The International Air Navigation Convention says all flight ops must align with the ship's centerline. What you're suggesting breaks aviation rules written after 15 years of carrier experience. This is an innovation. It's reckless." Cambell expected people to disagree. He didn't expect to be talked down to. Another officer joined in. "You're asking pilots to land across the way the ship moves. Carriers pitch and roll around their keel. With an angled deck, pilots will be coming in at an angle to that motion. They'll constantly be fighting drift. The landing surface will move in unpredictable ways. This won't reduce crashes. It'll cause more." Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart started to speak up, but Louis Boddington, the civilian engineer from Farnborough, raised his hand. "Show me the math," Boddington said. Cambell blinked. "Excuse me?" "The math," Boddington repeated. "You say pilots will struggle with drift. So, calculate it. Let's say the deck is angled 8 degrees and the ship rolls 12 degrees. What's the drift difference over a 30-second landing approach?" Silence. Boddington looked around at the room of engineers. "Anyone?" No one answered. "Then we test it," Boddington said. "Captain Cambell, Farnborough has a training runway painted with outlines. We'll mark an angled deck outline on HMS Triumph's flight deck. It's just paint, not a real structure. In 1 week, we'll run simulated approaches. If drift is actually a problem, we'll see it. And if it's just theory and fear, we'll see that too." Rear Admiral Slattery leaned back in his chair. "Louis, if you paint this angled deck on Triumph and pilots start crashing, you'll end your career and Captain Cambell's." "Understood, sir," Boddington replied. "But if it works?" He paused and added, "Then maybe we can stop killing pilots who did everything right." The test began in September 1951. HMS Triumph left Portsmouth with a simple white outline of an angled landing area painted on top of her standard deck. No physical changes, just lines. For the next 3 weeks, Navy pilots flew touch-and-go practice landings, treating the painted area like a real deck. And the drift problem? It didn't exist. Pilots adjusted after 2 tries. What they found wasn't confusion. It was relief. One of the test pilots, Lieutenant Peter Chilton, later wrote, "I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared. I pushed the throttle and climbed away. No barrier, no crash, no parked jets in front of me. Just air. A second chance. It felt like someone gave me my life back." By October, the painted deck test proved the idea worked. Now came the real challenge, convincing everyone else. The problem was Triumph was a British carrier. The Navy that needed this most was American. At the time, U.S. Navy pilots were dying at twice the rate of their Royal Navy counterparts. But convincing the U.S. Navy to take advice from the British wasn't going to be easy. On September 14, 1951, at the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, Royal Navy Test Pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown stood in front of 40 American test pilots. Every single one of them was sizing him up. Brown held the record for most aircraft types landed on a carrier. He had every British naval flying record that mattered. But none of that meant anything here, because he was about to tell a room full of American pilots that their carriers were designed wrong. "Gentlemen," Brown began, "in the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade?" A few hands went up, then more. In a moment, more than a dozen hands were in the air. "How many of you have lost someone to it?" Every hand in the room went up. Brown opened his briefcase. "I want to show you something the Royal Navy has been testing. It might sound crazy, but I've done 63 landings on it. And I'm here talking to you instead of being scraped off a deck. So please, just listen. He pinned Cambell's sketch to the wall. It showed a flight deck angled 8 degrees to the left. The room erupted. You want us to land sideways? The LSO won't be able to see the approach angle. You moved the landing path toward the island structure. Brown waited for shouting to die down. Every concern you just raised, we had them too. So we tested it. And here's what we found. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you don't die. You hit the throttle and try again. That's it. Commander Harold Buell, who led Fighter Squadron 84, stood up. Commander Brown, he said, I've been landing on carriers since 1943. Everything you're saying goes against 8 years of proven carrier doctrine. You're asking us to throw all that out for a British experiment. I'm asking you, Brown said calmly, to stop dying for a bad design. The room went quiet. Brown continued, You're landing jets on straight decks because that's what's available. But straight decks were built for Corsairs and Hellcats. Those planes could chop power and drop onto the deck. Jets can't do that. You're flying 1952 aircraft on 1942 carriers, and it's killing your people. The angled deck doesn't break doctrine. It fixes a carrier to fit the aircraft. Rear Admiral Apollo Sowsek, the top U.S. Navy aviator based in London, stepped forward. I've seen the tests on Triumph, he said. Commander Brown is right. The concept works. I've already recommended we start similar trials on USS Midway. But Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, head of the Bureau of Aeronautics, wasn't on board. We're already running tests, he said. The Davis barrier has a 98.7% success rate. Brown cut in. 98.7% of what? Planes that actually hit the barrier? What about the pilots who panic and ditch in the ocean just to avoid hitting it? Or the ones who don't even try because they see it coming and freeze up? That number says the barrier works, not that pilots survive. The room erupted. Some of the pilots nodded. Others looked like they wanted to toss Brown out. Admiral Sowsek raised his voice. Gentlemen, enough. The room quieted. We're going to test the angled deck on Midway. Paint only. Simulated landings. If it works, we'll upgrade one carrier for full trials. If it fails, the idea dies. But we are not going to keep losing pilots when we have a chance to fix the problem. Is that clear? Admiral Pride stood in silence for a long 10 seconds. Then, Midway trials approved. But if this British fantasy causes even one extra casualty, I'm shutting it down and taking everyone involved with it. Sowsek nodded. Understood. The meeting ended. Brown packed up, knowing he just risked his career on a painted line. What he didn't know was that within 90 days, that line would prove so successful the Navy would begin converting USS Antietam into the world's first real angled deck carrier. If you're into moments where one bold idea rewrites history, stay tuned. Because what happened next, when the first pilot touched down on Antietam's new deck, changed naval aviation forever. But before we get there, let's go to January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell lined up his F-9F-5 Panther behind USS Antietam. He'd done 42 carrier landings before, but this one was different. It was the first time he'd land on a real angled deck, not just paint, but steel. A welded 8-degree extension built into the carrier's hull. Buell didn't trust it. His whole career had taught him to catch the wire or crash. That fear had saved him before, and now they were asking him to let it go. He lowered his gear, adjusted the trim, and called in. Panther Ball 3.2. Roger Ball. The LSO replied. His approach was solid. Until it wasn't. A sudden gust lifted the nose. He was 6 feet too high. On a straight deck, that would have triggered a wave off. He'd have had to climb out, circle back, and try again. But this time, the LSO said nothing. On an angled deck, being high wasn't the end. It was just something to correct. Buell eased the nose down, dropped the extra altitude. Now he was long. He'd missed the wires. On a straight deck, this would have been a panic moment, where pilots often overcorrect and crash. But Buell remembered the briefing. If you miss, you go around. The deck is clear. Trust it. His wheels slammed onto the deck. The plane bounced. The hook skipped the first wire, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. He'd missed them all. On any other carrier, he'd already be tearing through the barricade. But here, there was nothing in the way, just open space. Buell slammed the throttle to full power. His jet engine spooled up slowly, 6 long seconds, but he was airborne again. 23 seconds later, he was back in line for another pass. This time, he nailed the 3-wire. Perfect landing. He climbed out of his jet shaking, not from fear, but from the relief he didn't even realize he'd been carrying for years. Later, in his autobiography, he wrote, "Landing a jet on an angled deck was pure joy. For the first time in my flying life, I wasn't scared of dying every time I made an approach. I didn't even realize how much that fear had weighed on me until it was gone." Over the next 2 months, Carrier Air Group 8 performed 1,327 landings on Antietam's angled deck. They had 8 missed wire landings, known as bolters, that required go-arounds. On a straight deck, that would have meant about 5 crashes, a couple destroyed jets, and at least 1 or 2 pilot deaths. On the angled deck, 0 crashes, 0 wrecked aircraft, 0 injuries. The numbers spoke for themselves. Before the angled deck, in 1950 and 1951, the U.S. Navy averaged 647 major carrier accidents each year, classified as Class A mishaps. More than half were landing-related. After angled decks rolled out between 1955 and 1957, those accidents dropped to 321 per year. Landing accidents used to make up 19% of all aircraft losses. After the angled deck came in, those crashes dropped by 75%. Fatalities caused by barriers fell by 80%. But statistics don't tell the real story. People do. On March 8, 1953, Lieutenant James Davidson brought his damaged Panther back to USS Antietam. His hydraulics had failed. He had no flaps. That meant he'd be landing about 20 knots faster than normal. On a straight deck, he wouldn't have tried. At 145 knots, crashing into the barrier would have likely killed him. He would have ditched in the ocean. But Antietam had an angled deck. Davidson made 4 passes. He missed the wires every time, until the 4th approach. Coming in at 142 knots, he caught the 4-wire. It was the fastest recorded successful carrier landing at that time. When he came to a stop, just 11 feet of deck remained. 6 months later, Davidson wrote a letter to Captain Dennis Cambell. "Sir, I've never met you, but I'm alive to write this letter because of an idea everyone said would never work. My daughter was born last month. I got to be there because you refused to accept that good pilots should die for bad design. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." By 1955, the British had added angled decks to Ark Royal. The French updated Clemenceau. Australia modified HMAS Melbourne. By 1957, every major Western Navy had either adopted the angled deck or was in the process of converting their carriers. The Soviets initially dismissed the idea. But in 1959, after a string of deadly crashes on their straight-deck carrier Variag, they quietly changed course. Soviet records declassified in 1993 show that within 6 months, their landing accidents dropped by 68%. Still, the strongest support came from the people who flew the planes. Captain John Moore flew combat missions over Vietnam from USS Coral Sea. He said, "I made 947 carrier landings between 1954 and 1973. I missed the wires, boltered 62 times. On a straight deck, that would have meant 62 chances to crash into a barrier, 62 chances to die, or kill the guys working on deck. Instead, I just flew around and tried again." Every pilot from my era has memories of friends who didn't survive the 1950s. We're alive because Dennis Cambell drew a line on a piece of paper and refused to stop fighting for it. By 1975, angled decks were everywhere. Young pilots didn't even realize carriers had ever been built differently. What was once a bold, controversial idea had become so standard, no one questioned it anymore. That's when you know a revolution has succeeded, when it becomes invisible. The angled deck saved thousands of lives. But Dennis Cambell never looked for attention. He never did interviews about it. When the innovation finally took hold, he quietly moved on. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1954 and attended the launch of HMS Ark Royal, the first carrier ever built from scratch with an angled deck. When reporters asked for a statement, Cambell pointed them to the engineering team at Farnborough. He didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted pilots to stop dying. In 1955, the U.S. Navy invited Dennis Cambell to the commissioning of USS Forrestal, the first American supercarrier with an angled deck, steam catapults, and an optical landing system. Cambell didn't attend. He sent his regrets. That same day, he went to the funeral of a Royal Navy lieutenant who had died in a helicopter training accident. It had nothing to do with carriers or the angled deck, but that lieutenant had once served under Cambell in 1943. And Cambell believed you always show up for your people. In 1957, he was awarded the CBE Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his contributions to naval aviation. The award citation was just 2 sentences long. He kept it tucked away in a drawer. He retired from the Navy in 1960 and joined Hawker Siddeley Aviation as a technical consultant, working on vertical takeoff jets. Co-workers remembered one thing about him. He cared about pilot safety more than anything else. He often frustrated design teams by insisting on extra safety features they thought were unnecessary. Engineer Anthony Marsh later recalled, Dennis would slow every review down, asking, "What if this fails at night? In a storm?" We'd tell him, "That only happens once in 10,000 flights." He'd say, "Then what does the pilot do when it's his flight?" He didn't care about odds. He cared about the one unlucky pilot. Dennis Cambell passed away on April 6, 2000, at age 92. His obituary in the Times ran 4 paragraphs. The Guardian ran 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither capture what it meant. Every single carrier landing since 1953 is possible because one man refused to accept that pilots should die just because that's how it's always been. Today, every aircraft carrier in the world, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, Russian, uses an angle flight deck. The U.S. Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford class carriers have cutting-edge tech like electromagnetic catapults and advanced arresting systems. But the deck is still angled 8 degrees to port, just like Cambell sketched it back in 1951. Across the U.S. Navy alone, pilots now perform over 15,000 carrier landings every year. About 8% of those are bolters, miss-wire landings that require a go-around. That's roughly 1,200 potential crashes every year that are avoided because of the angled deck. How many lives saved? Hundreds annually. Over 70 years? Easily tens of thousands. In 2003, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black of the U.S. Marine Corps, who flew F divided by a -18S from carriers between 1985 and 2007, tracked down Cambell's family and sent them a letter. It said, "I never met your father, but during my career, I made 147 carrier landings. I boltered 142 times, missed the wires completely and had to go around. That's 142 times I could have died. Instead, I just flew back and tried again. Your father gave me 142 second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life. On behalf of every carrier pilot who lived because of him, thank you." Cambell never saw that letter. He'd already been gone 3 years. But his son framed it, because Dennis Cambell never displayed his medals or awards. But that letter? He would have kept that one. The lesson behind all of this is simple but powerful. Not every breakthrough comes from experts. Sometimes it comes from someone who simply won't accept "that's just the way it is" as a good enough answer. Dennis Cambell was an engineer. He wasn't a test pilot. He was a career naval officer with a desk job and too many funerals in his memory. He saw a problem no one was solving, drew a line in a notebook, and asked, "Why not?" The angled deck saved more lives than any decoration ever awarded. It transformed naval aviation more than nuclear propulsion or smart weapons. And it didn't come from a committee or a lab. It came from one man's refusal to let things stay broken. That's the real story. That's why it matters. Because the next Dennis Cambell? They might not have rank, credentials, or a title. They might just be someone who sees something wrong and won't let it go. In history, the loudest voices don't always make the biggest changes. Sometimes, real change starts with one quiet person who simply refuses to let good people die for a bad idea.